We're very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming, especially on a rainy morning. And I'm Allison LaCroix. I'm professor of law in the law school and the Ludwig and Hilde teaching scholar. And I'm here with Jason Merchant, professor of linguistics, chair of the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, deputy dean for languages and instruction in the Humanities division. The full titles. And we're here to talk about the use and abuse of linguistics at the US Supreme Court. So I approach this from a law school perspective. I'm a constitutional law scholar. I'm also a legal historian. So I bring historical and legal interpretations and methodologies to bear on this. Jason brings linguistic techniques. And what we have been struck by, and the purpose of our project, which goes along with a seminar that we co-taught last year, is the fact that for the Supreme Court in particular, meaning and language and words are increasingly important. So starting back in about the 1980s, the Supreme Court and several attorneys general and others embraced the methodology of originalism. Sometimes they talked about it as original public meaning. What did the Constitution mean at the time, this little one, and this is not even all the Constitution, right? The Constitution itself is only about this part. What did the Constitution mean when it was drafted and ratified in 1789? Others wanted to go even more precise and talk about the original intent of the people who drafted it. So what did they mean by the words keep and bear arms or commerce among the states? So since the 1980s, this has really been a methodology on the rise on the Supreme Court, and we see it in a lot of constitutional decisions. And I think it's become even more prominent in the last few years, where the Supreme Court has really embraced original meaning to try to figure out the text of the Constitution. So what's happening is actually a valorization of original meaning. It's become the preferred interpretive mode of a majority of the justices, especially in recent years. And what is this about? Well, the emphasis is on deciding cases, constitutional cases, but also statutory cases, in conjunction with what the founders would have understood the meaning of the text to be. Fidelity to the founders' ideas. Now, originalism and textualism, which is slightly different, also make a normative claim about the fact that they are an interpretive methodology that controls judges' ability to, this is the most skeptical view, just make stuff up, right? Or just control judicial activism and limit the judiciary in lots of ways. So people make that kind of claim about it too, versus other methods. So other methods would include a more dynamic view of the Constitution. Let's say the range of possible meanings changes over time, interpretations of those meanings change over time. That's often called the living Constitution. There's another methodology or a kind of motivation of interpretation called active liberty, which Justice Breyer has talked about. He said, look for the underlying principles of the Constitution, one of which is this idea of active and engaged liberty. And there are many other variants. Common law constitutionalism is another one, which my colleague David Strauss has written a lot about. But to give you a flavor of what's at stake here, so when we talk about the Constitution and when we talk about the Supreme Court interpreting questions in light of the meaning of the text, the words of the text themselves, that's textualism, plain meaning, or some intention that we attribute to the drafters or to the ratifiers. So Justice Scalia, in one of his early scholarly works in 1997, a book called A Matter of Interpretation, Federal Courts and the Law. So Justice Scalia said a number of things. This is actually not on the screen, but he said, the American people have been converted to believe in the living Constitution, a morphing document that means from age to age what it ought to mean. If the courts are free to write the Constitution anew, they will, by God, write it the way the majority wants. This, of course, is the end of the Bill of Rights, whose meaning will be committed to the very body it was meant to protect against, the majority. So the worry, of course, is that anything that gets us away from this text is unmoored and will be just a football tossed around by current day majorities. So the motivation for the court, often for textualism and original meaning, is to say, this is a very good argument, this is an argument that has authority from the founders, and the alternative is basically chaos and the judges making it up. So that's how we've come to this project, to try to look from a linguistic and a historical and a legal perspective, what are they actually doing when they plumb original meaning and original intent? And what are they doing with text? Because increasingly, and we see this in the healthcare case, in Heller, the Second Amendment gun case, and lots of others, the justices, both the majority, the kind of originalists, and the dissenters, who we don't think of as subscribing to originalism, really going into the text and saying, we can figure out what these words mean, and we can do clause-by-clause interpretation. So that's what's at stake in our project. And now I'll turn it over to Jason to talk a little bit about our methodology.
Great. Thanks, Allison. Can you hear me? Now you can. So, as Allison said, this is a project that, that grew out, excuse me, I'm coming down with a cold here. This is a project that grew out of a class that we taught together, and our interest grew out of the fact that, as Allison mentioned, that the Supreme Court and lower courts following them have started doing more and more linguistics, essentially. So what does it mean to do linguistics is, in order to interpret the law, according to these opinions, we need to do a little bit of linguistics. So my interest in this came about by looking at it and saying, well, are they doing good linguistics? So before we start, I wanted to talk a little bit about what linguistics is and what parts of it they're doing. So when you know a language, you know a couple of things, at least a couple of things. Namely, you know the words of the language and you know the structures that they can occur in and how they get put together to make phrases and clauses. And the Supreme Court has done both of these kinds of analyses, both word analysis, the kind of things we associate with dictionaries, and we'll talk about one very famous case of that later, but they've also done things that are more structuralist, which is to say they had to parse out structural ambiguities in the law, in the text. So what's a structural ambiguity? Here's an example. Right, hitchhiking. Right. This is not, a lexical ambiguity is easy, that's just words that are homophonous. Structural ambiguities are a little bit harder to figure out, but they're very common. They give rise to strings that are homophonous, but have different meanings because they get put together in different ways. So just to give you a little bit of a boring linguistics example, because it's clear, if you say something like 5, Susan saw the man with the telescope, that has 2 readings. In other words, that's true in 2 different situations. It can truthfully describe 2 different situations. The speaker can utter that to describe these situations, and the understander has to use something other than the actual text, or in the case of verbal, the actual acoustics, to decide which of the 2 meanings is understood. And usually we do this all the time. There's all sorts of structural ambiguity constantly, and we rarely even notice it because one of the meanings is so salient and the other is not salient at all. And so we don't notice that we're doing this, but we are. So here's 2 examples. Susan saw the man with the telescope. There's a case where you can't see. The man with the telescope is a single individual, and that individual man has a telescope. We call this the modifier of the man reading. So with is a preposition. We have a prepositional phrase, and this prepositional phrase modifies the man, right? So in that sense, the man with the telescope is who Susan saw. Now the ambiguity goes away. In this reading, the prepositional phrase with the telescope modifies the verb phrase, right? Here's a verb phrase headed by the verb see, and it tells you what the instrument of the seeing event was, okay? It's just a matter of where you attach the prepositional phrase. And this is the kind of things that linguists study. These are the structures of these particular English sentences, for example. Now, why would the Supreme Court care? Well, if you followed the news last year, you probably noticed that the Supreme Court was involved in deciding a case that had reached them through the lower courts that had to do with the interpretation of this clause of the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, the relevant part in blue. Right? So the president shall have power to fill up vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate. So this is the so-called recess appointments power. The president, if there's a recess in the officers of the United States, which of course includes things from the Secretary of State all the way down to, in this case, the members of the National Labor Relations Board, who issued decisions, and those decisions were appealed on the basis that, on the claim that those board members were not properly appointed. Why? Because the vacancies that they had been appointed to by the president didn't happen during the recess of the Senate, right? So as we know, in the last couple of presidencies, presidents have more and more been using the recess appointments power because it's been harder and harder to get people confirmed by the Senate, which is what the Constitution saw as the main way of becoming an officer of the United States. And yet, if you have hundreds of people waiting months and months, sometimes years, to be confirmed, you have a government that doesn't work. So presidents have always used this power to get people into offices when either the Senate wasn't around, or in the recent cases, the Senate wasn't acting very well. So what does this mean? The question at hand is whether or not the power to fill up vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate, whether this prepositional phrase, headed by the preposition during, attaches to something low or something high. So here's the two structures. Here we have a prepositional phrase, during the recess of the Senate, and here's a rough and ready version of what the sentence structure is. The president shall have power to fill up vacancies that may happen. So at issue is whether or not this prepositional phrase attaches to this verb phrase. So the vacancies have to happen during the recess of the Senate. That can be a very short window, that the vacancy arises during that window, or whether or not he just has the power to do this action, whatever it may be, during the recess of the Senate. The practice of the US has always been that it's attached high, that he has the power to act during the recess of the Senate no matter when the vacancy arose, right? These are the two readings that you could have, right, if the prepositional phrase is attached low or if it's attached high. Now, it turns out that this question is not very hard to answer. In fact, because the Constitution has another version of this exact same phrase where the ambiguity goes away. So in Article 1, we read about vacancies happen by resignation or otherwise during the recess of the legislature. The executive thereof may make temporary appointments. Well, now, because of the word order here, during has to be attaching to happen, the verb phrase. And that's exactly why when I say the man with the telescope, Susan saw, you don't get any sort of ambiguity. The man has the telescope in that case, and that's similarly in this case. So that's kind of easy. A harder question that came up in this same case had to do with the nature of the word the, right? During the recess of the Senate. And it sounds like a joke, right? Like the. How hard could it be to know what the means? I'm sure many of you will remember the fun that late night comedians had with Bill Clinton's answers to the special prosecutor during the Lewinsky scandal, where he said, "Oh, it depends on what the word is means." Everybody thought that's so hilarious. And the only people who didn't laugh at that joke were linguists, philosophers, and psychologists of language, because it's one of the hardest questions in our fields to try to figure out what that word means. And the same thing goes for the. So here's what you could say. You could say, well, we know what the means, right? We just look it up in a dictionary. Now, the methodology here that the courts have been using is to look it up in contemporary dictionaries, right? They don't look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, the American Heritage Dictionary, published in 1950. They look it up in dictionaries that were contemporary to the time of the ratification of the Constitution. One of the most prominent of which is Samuel Johnson's dictionary. So here's what Samuel Johnson's dictionary says about the word the. The, article, de, Dutch. Just in case you want to know what the word for de, for the in Dutch was. I'm not sure why he included that, but the article denoting a particular thing. And then he gives some examples. So there we go. So now we know, right? All done. Well, let me give you a little bit of background on what dictionaries do. Right? Obviously, dictionaries define words. They also do other stuff. We're not interested in the other stuff they do. And one of the things that we tend to use dictionaries for, if you're an adult, and you don't constantly just Google words as a stand-in for a dictionary, is to look up weird words, words that we encounter in reading or hearing that are outside our ken, or we not understand their usage, and so we look it up, right? And this works great for words like peripatetic, right? It's a weird word. It's a SAT word. It's one of those really, low-frequency words. Not everybody knows it. You might read it and think, I don't know what that means. You'd grab a dictionary, and the dictionary would tell you. Here's an example. Right. Contemporary peripatetics evolved from hunter-gatherers. It means walking around. The dictionary will tell you that it comes from the Greek and to mean walk around. What it won't tell you necessarily is this information. So we put this up here, the rank order. This is if you rank all the words in English by frequency. You can say, here's the number 1 word, number 2, number 3. This guy's number 36,000. So it's pretty far down, right? This corresponds, it means that you'd have to hear or read about 3.5 million words to encounter one instance of this guy, right? It's a long tail if you're familiar with the statistics, right? There's a lot of words that have very low frequencies, right? So that's a lot of words, 3.5 million to hit peripatetic once. Likewise for pecuniary, right? It's a little more frequent. You only have to go about 1 million words before you hit one instance of this, which is why kids don't learn it, right? And it's not just 1 million words, it's 1 million words directed at particular audiences. So typically people talking to kids are not going to use pecuniary, so you'll be near adults before you encounter this word, and then maybe you didn't look it up. Now, if you do look it up, I took this example from Dickens because I remember learning this word. Yes? I don't know how. Alice, or maybe they can, yeah, it's kind of hard to see. Thanks. So I remember learning this word because I was in high school reading Dickens, and he uses the word. And I said, I don't know what that word means. So I looked it up in the dictionary, and it means having to do with financial affairs or monetary affairs or something like that, right? So he was in pecuniary difficulties, means he didn't have a lot of money. That was his euphemism. And it comes from the Latin word pecunia, which it means money, among other things, right? And so that's what a dictionary will tell you. Now the dictionary, I should say, that sounds like that's all you need to know. It's really not, right? The dictionary will say something like relating to or having to do with money or monetary affairs. That doesn't tell you enough as an English speaker to know when to actually use this word. Because we have other words that are similar, like monetary itself, like financial. And just knowing the definition is not quite enough, right? So you still wouldn't then say, you know what, I need to switch my pecuniary institution because I really hate their ATMs, right? Pecuniary, you can't just switch it for financial. It's not really a synonym for financial. It just gives you a sense of where it should be used, and then you've got to like actually encounter the actual usages to know when English speakers really use this word. And if you're Dickens, you use it like this. Now you think this is hard enough, but it's actually very easy for words that have very low frequencies because they're used in a very small set of contexts. So it's easy to define them. Once you get to words that are more frequent, you find that the problem of defining them, it gets harder, not easier. Of course, you're more familiar with them, so you may not have thought about it this way. You never looked this word up in a dictionary. But if you did, you would find that they had a whole list of things. So you have words like bank. Of course, bank is a classic example of homophony. Right? There's the river bank and there's the financial institution bank, right? There's just two different banks, and that's what a dictionary will tell you. It has a frequency, as you can see, 1 in 20,000. Set, right? Nobody ever looked up the word set. No kid ever asked what does that mean, set? Right? It's a word that kids learn very early because it's very highly frequent, 1 in 3,300 words, right? So kids are going to hear this on a daily basis, basically. So what's weird about this word, as you can see from the examples I put up there, is that this word is highly, I don't know, we could call it ambiguous for now. I don't know if it's homophony, if it's something else, if it's vague in some cases. But you can see that knowing that the word is used for the word in the phrase TV set is not going to help you when you learn set theory, right? Maybe it's a different word in that case, but that's what contributes to its frequency. The fact that it's used in all these different kinds of contexts makes it frequent. It also makes it hard to explain to other people and to translate. Of course, if you think about how to translate it, different languages may not have exactly this set of range of meanings and ambiguity, so you'll have to find the right correspondent, right? Seems obvious. Well, guess what the most frequent word in the English language is? The, right? All right, what have we learned? Well, if we've learned anything, it means the probably is really hard to define. If you have to tell somebody who doesn't know the word the what it means, good luck. Right? And many, many languages, English is one of a minority of languages that actually has something like a definite article. Many languages do just fine without it, from Latin to Swahili to Chinese to Russian to Turkish, to name your language, right? So defining this is not so easy. And I'm sure if any of you know speakers of other languages, of those languages I just mentioned, who have learned English, you'll notice that once in a while they misuse the articles, the versus the, or they drop it, or it's really not easy to tell somebody when to use the. You can definitely say when they should have used the. No, you had to use the there. But now try to explain the general rule, either by the meaning or the structure, good luck. Write a book. I mean, books have been written. Now, dictionaries are interesting objects, right? They're great. As a linguist and a philologist, I love dictionaries. I own a lot of them. But we don't want to ascribe to them superpowers, right? They're written by humans, just like you or me. They're sometimes crowdsourced, like the OED was. And they have partial coverage in some cases. So this is a couple of graphs. You can see that this is the number of words in the Google corpus. So the Google Books project has gone and started scanning in books from lots of different languages, going back as far as they can. You may have heard about, recent questions about copyright, et cetera, for books that are still under copyright, but they've been going back to things that are way out of copyright. And they've assembled this massive corpus, trying to scan everything in. At one point, a couple years ago, when this paper was published, they had scanned in 5% of all books ever published in the planet. That's a huge amount of words, right? And what they did was, then they looked at the number of words that those things contained, and they did some more things that we'll talk about in a second. But they could estimate the size of the printed vocabulary. That's not the same thing as saying that the language has X number of words, but it's not unrelated, right? So if you look back, they found that in 1900, English texts consisted of about 500,000 words, right? And by 2000, English texts, meaning including the web, had about 1 million individual separate words. So the vocabulary had expanded, and you can imagine why, what we count as being English had expanded. We've been borrowing a lot of words. We've been creating new ones for new technologies, et cetera. And we've just been printing more things. More kinds of words are getting onto the page that didn't used to get into books 100 years ago, are now appearing in blogs and whatnot, right? So we have a better sense of what the vocabulary is. This shows you what the coverage of these three of the main dictionaries of English are: the OED, Webster's Third, and the American Heritage Dictionary, 4th edition. These are the number of words that they have in them. None of them even hit 500,000. They're all very big, right? The OED is 20 volumes. It's a huge dictionary. And these guys are no slackers either, but they don't come close to covering the entire vocabulary of English, and no dictionary does. Not even, the Grimm Brothers Dictionary of German, which was 40 volumes or something. It can't even fit on a shelf. Doesn't cover everything, okay? And what don't they cover? Well, obviously they're going to all have things like the and set in them, and even peripatetic. What they don't cover is the very infrequent words. So you can see that as the words become less and less frequent, you get 10 to the minus 8 here for frequency, the coverage, the inclusion in those dictionaries starts to drop, which is exactly what you'd expect, right? So how is this relevant? This is relevant because the other question that the court faced had to do with how to interpret this word the, right? So they've decided that the during phrase has to attach in one place. That's fine. But the other question was, which things count as recesses of the Senate? So we have a Senate, and every once in a while they go away. They go on vacation, right? They take a break. They go home for Christmas and New Year's in particular. And they break in between the sessions of Congress, which happens every 2 years after the House elections and the Senate elections. 1/3 of the Senate gets elected every 2 years. So there's various times at which they're not there. Now, whether or not they're in session is the question here, right? So what does it count to be in session? And what does it mean to be the recess of the Senate? So the recess is when you're not in session. Well, does that mean only every 2 years in between whatever it is when they go away on December 15th and they come back in early January? Those 3 weeks are the only time that the president can appoint things? Or is it any Christmas to New Year's when they're gone? Or is it just any break at all when they go home for the weekend, or somebody's not in the chamber? I mean, you can see there's a long climb here. What happened in this particular case is that Obama made a couple of appointments that happened not during the session between the two sessions, during the recess between the two sessions of Congress. That's called the intra-session recess, inter-session recess, but rather during that Christmas break in the middle of the session. So the 2-year session, there's a Christmas in between, and that's the intra-session recess, and that one was the one he appointed these people. And they said, no, that doesn't count, because the recess has to be that one. This is the court that decided this was the Court of Appeals in DC in this case, Noel Canning versus the NLRB. And the court's opinion was based and cited this definition that I just showed you, we just saw. This is, he says, contemporaneous dictionaries, namely Samuel Johnson, right, treated the as, quote, noting a particular thing. So that solves the case, right? So he said, guess what? Those appointments are void because they didn't happen during the particular recess. There's only one recess, and so he voided all of the decisions issued by the board were invalid. So the Supreme Court took this up. And the questions that are at issue here are lexicographical questions. Take a look. So what we're interested in, first of all, is whether or not Samuel Johnson's definition is adequate. And we can very quickly establish that it's not, as you might expect for such a frequent word. Saying that it denotes a particular thing is not quite enough. Or if, to the extent that particular means anything at all, it's not going to rule out any of those other interpretations that we talked about for the word recess. So for example, if particular means specific, right, we think about, you know, if I can talk about the watch on this table because there's only one watch. It's a unique individual and it's a specific individual. There's a particular watch on this table and there are no other watches, so we don't get confused. That's particular and specific. But the word the in English is not restricted to such usages of an actual occurring individual. It has these other usages too, which, you know, take a look at examples in 1 through 3. The madrigal is a polyphonic compositional form. That means any madrigal is a polyphonic compositional form. It's not just a particular madrigal, right? When the Greeks first encountered the hippopotamus, they called the animal horse of the river. All of the thes here don't refer to particular individuals at a particular time in one episode, etc. We can't pick them out. They're all generic, the Greeks, right? Whoever they were, whoever encountered the hippopotamus, which is singular, but doesn't denote a particular animal, it denotes the kind of the animal, right? During the day, the funniest one here, I think, is during the day I allow my daughter to wear my socks. At night, I don't. Just saw what I wrote. So English is weird. Why do we use the here but not here? Why don't we say during the night or at the night? We don't. We have to say at night. But we don't say at day. There's a non-parallel. There's some sort of asymmetry there. Who knows why, right? It doesn't matter. The point is that this day here, it's not during the, you know, the one day, the birthday, or, you know, the Christmas 2009. It's not picking out a particular day. It's just saying for any day, right? This is what a generic use of the word the is. And Samuel Johnson, actually, if you look at his definitions, I'm sorry, not if you look at his definitions, if you look at his examples, he includes a bunch of things that cannot possibly be assimilated to his own definition. I mean, he wasn't an idiot. He just didn't try very hard. And I don't blame him because it's really, really hard to write a really good definition of the word the. Bertrand Russell tried it famously in 1905, and people have been working on it ever since. And we're not done yet. Okay, but that's not important here. What's important is just to notice that the use of the word the is consistent, even in modern English, our own Englishes, with a generic use for essentially picking out any recess you want. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what we did in the Google Ngram corpus. So I mentioned the Google Books project. What they did was they pulled out all the words out of all the books that they've ever got, and they made a list of it. That list consists of a bunch of what linguists call unigrams, single words. But they also pulled out all the pairs of words, pairwise. Every single pair of words that are adjacent to each other, they pulled those out. And those are called bigrams, two next to each other. And then they did it for trigrams as well, and you get why this is called the Ngram corpus, because you can do it for any n, from 1 to whatever. In practice, nobody does it past 5. Nobody even does it to 4, because the numbers just explode, and the return on investment becomes very low, because you don't learn much more when you look at 4 than what you find out when you look at 3. But what this does is it makes it really interesting. They did two things. First, they did all that, which is a huge computational effort, and then they made it available to researchers like me and like you. They built an interface, and I should say this is a picture of a screen grab of part of the Google Ngram interface that's available online. In our research, we used an interface that was written by a linguist at BYU, Mark Davies, but you can do this too. The linguist interface has a few more tools than the Google ones, but the Google, every year they're catching up. They keep on adding new search tools and strings and wildcards and all sorts of other really cool things you can do. So now anybody can do this kind of research that would have taken literally lifetimes to do just a generation ago. So here's what we did. We wanted to look at what the word the meant. Now we can't do that directly. It's very hard to do directly. We don't have time travel. We can't go back and ask questions of speakers in the late 18th century. So we took as a proxy, we said, well, we know what we think it means, and we know how it can be used now. Let's see whether or not it's changed. and how that'll influence our interpretation of the Constitution. So we looked at pairs where it looked like you could either have the word the or not to sort of get an intuition about when people were using when people use the word the now and when they used it in the old days. So this, this goes from 1800 to 2000, and you can see we picked this pair with, I'll show you a few pairs here. We picked the pair with the knowledge of and with knowledge of, not because they're synonymous, but because they seem to be almost synonymous, and it'll help us identify usage patterns that aren't due necessarily to semantics. Now, there's obviously going to be some semantics in there, but this is our best shot at controlling for that. And what you see, if you compare with knowledge of and with the knowledge of, is that with knowledge of is more frequent now than with the knowledge of. So the definite article has lost favor. But if you go back 200 years, the definite article was I can't even see, was 9 times as frequent as not having the definite article in these cases. So it was much, much more frequent. Why? We don't know, right? I mean, the speakers at that time were using the definite article in a way that is much less common now. So we looked at things like this: in the view of versus in view of. Both are used, have been used for the entire span. In the view of used to be more common than in view of, and in view of got really popular in the 50s and 60s, and it's been dropping since then. But in any case, it's I can't see the numbers exactly. Something like 4 times as frequent today as its counterpart with the, whereas back 2 centuries ago it was the opposite. That the use of the word the was twice as frequent as without. Here's another example for the love of versus for love of. Both phrases exist throughout the history of the corpus, but again, here their relative frequencies haven't changed very much, only their absolute frequencies. And here's where we start to get the interesting stuff, right? We're really interested in the word recess and whether or not they use the word the with recess or not. And what we found is in recess and in the recess, both are used nowadays. In recess without the is used more frequently than in the recess. But go back 200 years and it's huge, right? It swamps. The use of the definite article swamps the absence of the definite article. Right, let me show you. So if you go back to 1800, right, this is almost all of the occurrences of these two are going to have the word the in them. And slowly recess starts to come up and the recess starts to come down. And about 1950, they're even. That means if you count all the instances of these two, of this trigram and this bigram, you'll find that about 50% is this and 50% is that at about 1950, right? So I'm going to represent that this way. It's exactly the same information, but just shown to you differently. So in around 1950, these guys are at about 50%, right? Before that, the is just swamping, right? It's like noise. The other one is noise. So people were using the all the time, basically. 100%, 90%, this is up in the high 90s. Then we start to fall down, and now in recess is winning over in the recess, but that's a recent development. But what does that mean for the interpretation? What it means is, the one thing we can definitely conclude is that our current intuitions, those of us who grew up in the 20th century, learning English in the 20th century, we can't apply our intuitions to the usages and the patterns found in the 18th century, because those were different, right? We acquired the in a way in which we feel that this is a natural distribution for the usages of the. In the 18th century, writers were using the word the much more than we would today. We don't know why they were using it, but we know that's the fact. That's what we've discovered. The historical fact is the was used in a lot of places, in a lot of times, contexts, situations in which modern writers don't use it. That means our intuitions, as we acquired English, we acquired frequencies and probabilities about the, and we acquired the meanings and the structure of the from our context. That context has shifted significantly from what it was for the founders and for the framers of the Constitution. And that has to inform how we interpret it. We can't, this is basically, what do we call it, a cautionary tale that says don't just blindly think that you know what the words mean when you go and you read an old text. You have no choice but to apply what you know, but you should always put an asterisk next to it and say, I could be wrong. I might be imposing my own view of what this word means, and it didn't mean that to those. We do that obviously when we read people like Shakespeare, where the language has changed enough that we know that I can't make sense of this unless I learn what he meant by it. But we're not so careful, I feel, when we do things from 18th century America, and we should be. Here's for during the recess. This is the phrase, right, the real money phrase. During the recess has the same pattern. During the recess is much, much more frequent than during recess. During recess, well, nowadays we have recess at school, but during recess sounds like a generic, but it didn't back then because it wasn't even used. All right, and likewise for if you just look at the use of the with recess over time, you find the same pattern. All right. So, this is the conclusion that we reach. The DC court their opinion rested on a serious descriptive mistake. Luckily, when we did this research back in the Supreme Court hadn't issued their opinion, so we were all on pins and needles waiting to see what way the Supreme Court would go. The Supreme Court agreed with us, as we like to say. They reached the correct opinion, which was that the DC court was wrong, and they overturned that. Right. So in fact, it was a unanimous opinion, as you can see the relevant parts here, including the fact that the has a generic use. All right. Now, this is all very good if you're President of the United States and appointing people during the recess. But what about things a little closer to home? All right. The New York Times published an editorial earlier this year talking about our mayor's attempt to circumvent or reintroduce gun control laws after they were struck down. Chicago used to have a ban on selling guns. That ban is gone. Why? Because in 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in a case that we're going to look at, Heller v. DC, that it's unconstitutional to ban the sale and possession of guns on an individual level. Right? So this is the individual right to keep and bear arms. This is pretty high stakes. Here's the sorry. The text of the Second Amendment. So we can apply the same sort of questions, and the Supreme Court did address many of these questions in that opinion. The question is, what does bear arms mean? So in this phrase, what did it mean then? Does it confer an individual right, as the court decided in 2010, or is it really talking about a collective right that has to do with the organization of militias or other entities for self-defense and military activity? So some of the ways that a linguist can look at this, and we decided that's a very big issue. There's been huge books written on that. We're not going to try to answer those questions. We're going to try to answer simpler questions that we can do now because we have access to the Google Ngram corpus. So is bear arms an idiom? Does it mean something, like participate in military? We can ask questions like, is it always with the word arms? Do you ever get like bear a rifle or bear a shotgun or bear a musket or something like that? Because if bear just means carry or own as with keep, then you might expect to find singular objects as well, right? Why not? Does the subject of bear arms always have to be collective? So, or can it be individual? And does it always have to be plural? Those are separate questions. You'll see in a second. And then E, we'll talk about. So here's what Scalia wrote in that opinion. I'll let you look at it for a second. Right. He said keep arms just meant possess weapons. That's all it meant. And maybe he's right. What we did was to look at the phrase bear arms, and then dig down into the data a little bit. So let me tell you, this is from 1780 to 1795. This is just the simple bigram bear arms. So you can see it was very low frequency, and then boop, it popped up in the 1780s. It kind of dropped down, which is funny because this is ratification here. It's the war. Right? Yeah. It's the war. They wrote a lot about bearing arms during the war. And then there was the war. Oh, you're all done. So what's interesting about the Google Ngram corpus is not only can you generate this, but if you can go in and look at the actual textual attestations for every instance that comprises this. We also search for things like bear an arm or bear a weapon, 0%. So it didn't occur with singular objects, which may or may not be probative. Likewise for other things. It's really part of an expression, bear arms, right? That's what the texts tell us. Nobody was using bear to mean carry a musket or anything else, or even plurals like bear rifles, bear muskets, bear pistols, or bear weapons. That's not to say that arms is an opaque piece of an idiom chunk, like in kick the bucket. You know, John kicked the bucket. There's no actual bucket there. It just means he died. Arms is used in other cases and to refer to weapons, right? Those are some expressions there. So here's what we did. We went and looked at bear arms and we pulled out all of those occurrences, 143 of them, and we looked at each one of them and we coded them. And here's how we coded them. We coded them both by whether or not the subjects were singular or plural, and whether or not the subjects denoted a collective or individual. So I'll give you some examples here. Collectives are things that refer to groups like Adam and Eve together, the men, they, 1,000 Protestants, every man, an army, a committee. They can be singular or plural, right? It's independent of being a collective. And individuals are obviously things like Adam, the man, he, I, but also things like the scissors and pants. Those are the so-called pluralia tantum. They are grammatically plural, but they denote an individual, single object. And we coded them, and we also had heraldic and other uses that we couldn't identify, and here's what we found. So let me give you some examples. When you click through, you can actually, it'll give you a reference like this to, in this case, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, where he uses this. For they likewise bear arms. In this case, we coded this as collective plural, right? And in this case, here were 1,000 Protestants fit to bear arms, again, a collective plural use. So this is what you see when you click through to the individuals. You can also go even farther, and if you click on these, which we did, you can find the actual OCR, the actual scan of the text. So you can read the entire book if you want to, so you can see the context. It's not just pulling a single phrase out of context the way the OED did and has to. You can read the entire text if you want to. So here's one. Every man was obliged to bear arms, right? We also found examples of individual singular uses that will make Justice Scalia happy, right? So things like Samuel Johnson in writing in the works of the English poets, he says, when I was strong and able to bear arms. Now, I is a singular individual, right? So we coded it as IS, individual singular. It's not a singular that denotes a collective, and it's not a plural that denotes an individual. It's a singular individual. This is the kind of case that you really want to see a lot of if you think that bear arms was a phrase used in the late 18th century to talk about individuals, individual rights. And I couldn't help but put up an example from Hamlet. This is Humanities Day, right? You may recall from the Act 1 with the two gravediggers making these jokes about blah, blah, blah. It's a funny, very funny scene. They're talking about Adam, the first man. He says he was the first that ever bore arms, and it's a play on words about him having a coat of arms, being a gentleman, but also holding a spade, which was taken to be the weapon, but for digging a grave. So this phrase was around and was used in lots of different ways. Here are our results. We found, like I said, a lot of collective plurals, 59%, a few collective singulars, and a few individual singulars, no individual plurals, and a few undetermined and heraldic uses. So here's the same data, but in a pie chart, a little bit easier to see, I think, right? All of this is the collective plural, right? And this part is the collective singular, and this here, this green section, which is about 5% of the whole, are the individual singulars. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the Constitution granted a 5% right? No, that's not how we do it, right? That doesn't make any sense. Does that mean that that there's a 95% chance that Scalia is wrong? Again, we can't conclude that, right? It's not exactly what this data shows. It just shows us that the use in an individual singular context was very rare in the late 18th century. That's all we can say, all right? So I'm going to let Allison tell you about what the morals of this story are.
Okay. Time for some law side moralizing. So we have a couple of morals which I'll describe and then I'll fill in a little bit. So one moral is, as you see, that the courts, and it's not just the Supreme Court, it was the DC Circuit for a large part of our criticism in the recess appointments case. But they're abusing old dictionaries. So what does that mean? I think, and you can see it, there's a certain style of argument in judicial opinions where they will say, but now we must turn to linguistic analysis. And as I always sort of feel when they say historical analysis, so I now feel with linguistic, where I have to admit I feel somewhat skeptical of what's about to follow. They're not linguists, they're not historians, they're upfront about that. But the idea of just pulling the dictionary down off the shelf, dictionaries were, as Jason has said, created for lots of different reasons, under imperfect conditions, et cetera, in the 18th century. Samuel Johnson's just one person. So the dictionaries can't really bear the weight that they are being used for in these cases. Second, this is our second moral, historical text mining with linguistic training. So what we've been doing with the Ngram corpus and the other work that we've done can better reveal patterns of usage. And actually, that's what we care about. It's the context that if we care about whether what the founders originally meant, what did James Madison have in mind when he wrote the words, or what would ordinary speakers of English at the time in 1789 have understood, that's usage. And this makes for better legal practice. So one could still be an originalist and do what we've done. It might make the conclusions a little more attenuated, but you could still do it, but you would just have to be attentive to the context and the usage at the time, and these are tools that allow us to do this. So let me say a few more things about sort of where our research has left us so far and kind of where we're going with it. So the payoffs, right? People always want to know, well, what are the payoffs of this approach? Or in a less pecuniary sense, what can we take from this? Sort of, so what? One is that the historical semantics approach, which is what we've been calling this, demonstrates, as I said, that a lot of what passes for linguistic analysis by judges and advocates is incomplete, it's pseudoscientific, and yet it has this veneer of authority in the same way that historical sources also do. So if one can say, well, you know, I've read Blackstone and he says this and this, and then other people may feel somewhat awed by that. Of course, there's probably some other part of Blackstone that contradicts it. That's what happened in the Heller case in 2008. The majority and the dissenters were fighting back and forth about which Federalist essay, which section of Blackstone, what about these statutes from the 1820s? So as Jason said, we can't rely on our modern intuitions. And in other work that I do, I study the history of federalism. And there's often a sense of, well, federalism, we still talk about that. We still care about that. We know what that means. We don't know what they meant by it, though. And so, if we care about what people at some remote time with a distinct set of linguistic practices meant, then we actually have to at least remind ourselves that we do not, in fact, recognize everything they're saying. We can't intuit it. So we can't rely on our intuitions, or to be more scientific, our algorithms. There's this real appeal of the kind of, well, there's an algorithm that can answer this, but we can't just deploy them in an uninformed and uncritical way. And also, so this is a more fine-grained finding, linguistic analysis can tell us which meanings were possible and probable at a given time, and what their relative distribution and frequency were. Now, are we limited by what's in the corpus? Yes. Historians are always limited by what has survived in the printed record, what we're able to find evidence of. But most of the time, and this is contra what the Supreme Court often says, many more meanings were possible at the relevant time, say 1789, than a quick glance through the dictionary would suggest. So more meanings were out there then. But on the flip side, we are less able to say categorically that a given meaning was not possible at a given time. So can we show that the individual singular was never used? No, in fact, we can show that it was used sometimes. So it's always harder to prove a negative. That's true in this case. But linguistic analysis can guide a sophisticated interpreter to likely possibilities and away from less likely ones, especially, again, when those less likely ones seem familiar to us just because the usage is different. So for constitutional interpretation, to the extent one wants to just look at the text itself, or maybe the text plus a little bit of original meaning and original intent, it's incomplete. At some point, we can't look to the dictionaries to supply certain answers, and to analogize to another interdisciplinary methodology that the Supreme Court occasionally adopts, we think that doing textual analysis with only dictionaries is like doing law and economics with only a pocket calculator, which my understanding is they wouldn't do, and law and economics folks would say, is not actually the appropriate way to do that. So that's our argument to the court. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great. You want to take questions?
Yeah,
sure.
Time for a few questions.
Sure.
It would. I mean, the American dictionaries didn't get started until a little bit after the founding period. So Noah Webster is the big one, obviously, and he had a real project of Americanization that was part of nation building, and we're going to simplify spellings, get rid of the U in honor and behavior, who needs it, and others. But yeah, I mean, so on the other hand, they were all British, right, until, well, 1776 or 1789. So I think the court's argument would be these are the authoritative usages for the drafters. But right, certainly, I mean, when people were in British North America circa 1607, they were encountering things and using concepts and words differently from what people in the metropole would have been doing.
And I'll just add that we did not filter our results by origin, by place of publication. You can do that if you want to just look at things published in England versus America. We didn't do that. So, yeah, there was a question here.
This may not be in the spirit of the University of Chicago, but have you guys actually taken this kind of research out into the world and done amicus briefs?
Well, I think each of us has signed an amicus brief in one of these cases.
So there have been such briefs from linguists.
Yes, and historians. And then it's interesting, there's this whole social science and legal research about, do amicus briefs matter, do they read them? They're aware of them. I mean, they do cite, I think in Heller, they cite the linguist's brief, they cite the historian's brief, and we've done some blog posts. Then there's a separate question about reception and filtration. But yes, we're trying to put the word out.
Well, another moral before I take another question is that we're hopeful that law students will learn this methodology and be able to do it when they go to write briefs. It's not hard to do. It just takes a little bit of training, a tiny bit. I mean, anybody can do it. I don't want to encourage everybody to just do, their own, but go ahead and you can do these searches, and then with a little bit of training and knowledge about how to interpret them, this could inform legal practice going forward. This is what we always say, we're not trying to convince Scalia. We're trying to convince the people who might clerk for Scalia. So, yeah. So she's wondering about that drop in the frequency of the use of the word "the," which was, I think if it comes back. Where was the slide with the in it? This one. Yeah, this slide. So we didn't just look at the. I mean, we could run that. So that would be an easy unigram search. We just looked at the recess versus recess. So I don't know if it's true that the has gone down, but yeah, we should check that. It's pretty simple to check. Somebody could do it on their phone by the time this question period is over. Yeah.
Do you have an opinion whether the Supreme Court does this kind of analysis and then reaches a conclusion, or starts with a conclusion and figures out how to use the analysis to support it?
So the question is the Supreme Court and methodologies, and do they know where they're going, or do they apply the methodology and see where it leads them? It's interesting, when you read these opinions, often there's a lot of discussion from the justices who are currently kind of in the majority, loosely speaking. So Justice Scalia, the Chief Justice, and others. And there's another case like this that I was just reading, where they sort of say, the text of this statute is ambiguous. And then there's a fight, and then quickly they move from the text is ambiguous, so how will we know what it means? Well, we should look to original meaning, and we should look to, or the plain meaning of the text, again, slightly different. And then there will be skirmishing about, well, is it really ambiguous? And even within that group, I mean, this recent case I'm thinking of about the treaty power, there was a disagreement between Justice Scalia and Chief Justice Roberts about whether, in fact, it was ambiguous. So I think they certainly, they're human, and they have developed methodologies. So I think when Justice Scalia sees a case like this, he definitely thinks this is going to involve original meaning and textualism, skepticism of development, skepticism of other things. But I don't think they know the answer. I mean, I think there's really good data and evidence, not only data, but just kind of, we know this empirically and from observation, that the oral arguments are informative to the justices and do, in some cases, give them arguments or help them figure out what they think about things. So I don't think they come into it with an answer. I think they come into most of these cases with tendencies and ways, lenses that they prefer. Can we take one more? Okay. Yes. Interesting. So the question is, given that the Constitution was written by and for property-owning white males, is there any way in the Constitution itself or otherwise to update that? There's really interesting work, historical work on the ratification process by Pauline Mayer, who had a great book a few years ago called Ratification, which actually returns to us the sense of how radical it was, that they actually were thinking about property-less white men. So it wasn't entirely the kind of the propertied classes standing to benefit. And that they were, you know, at least thinking about, relative to what else was available at the time, things that were a little more expansive. Okay, but still very limited. Well, one of the greatest or most important ways to update it, and even originalists take this into account, are the Reconstruction Amendments. So you can't find an originalist who says the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments ending slavery, enfranchising African Americans, and the equal protection and due process clauses. That's all part of the original core to them. They acknowledge those amendments as original, even though they're not from 1789. So, okay, that's obviously incorporating a bigger group of people. The 14th Amendment says any person. It doesn't say citizen. There's good evidence that some people at that time meant that to include more than. I mean, by its nature, they were trying to include freed African Americans and former slaves. So yeah, I mean, I think there are ways actually even within the text of the Constitution to include other groups in its own terms. Textualists and originalists do that to some degree. The question is often how great are those rights, or what are the ways in which they are legally cognizable? And then you get into more questions about, well, can this person bring a private right of action? You know, do they have a lawsuit? Yeah, they may have some right, but how do they do it? Other theories, I think, are more expansive and say, look, at the spirit was liberationist and radical in these following ways. And if you trace that forward, it leads in certain directions. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.